Hi, this is Mike here for another OASIS through the Bible, and we're looking at April 19th. We're going to be going through 1 Kings 13 through 2 Kings chapter 8. And here are some of the observations that I saw, and you can see these in the notes in the email that I send you. First one was prayer. We see the man of God, and we see him interceding for Jeroboam's sin. We see Elijah, several prayers, and Ahab actually humbles himself, which we'll look at a little bit later. Jehoshaphat wanting to seek God's will in matters, and then of course Elisha. Then there's a lot about disobedience. We see Jeroboam. He made idols, made Asherah poles, caused Israel also to sin in the same way. He tried to arrest the man of God. He appointed priests who were not Levites, and there were lots of consequences for his actions that will be in the notes there. The man of God, he stopped to eat at Bethel, which God specifically told him not to do, and he allowed another prophet to change his mind and disobey God, which is kind of a good lesson that we need to make sure that we're clear that we're following God and no one else. We don't let anyone talk us out of doing God's will, no matter what their title or position is. Judah's disobedience. They made high places, sacred stones, Asherah poles. There's a reference here to even had male shrine prostitutes, which would include having female ones as well. So that just shows the extent of the evil that Judah had done. And what's interesting is we see Solomon's disobedience or sin continuing after his death because of Rehoboam's mother was in chapter 14 of 1 Kings, verse 21 and 31. This is repeated twice. She was an Amorite. So kind of, again, Solomon's downfall of marrying foreign wives who led him astray from serving God because of all of their idols and false gods. So we see that emphasis there. Then Ahab, some interesting things said about Ahab, that he did more evil than any before him in chapter 16, verse 30. And there was never anyone like Ahab behaved in the vilest manner. That was in 21, verse 25 to 26. Of course, the consequences were the drought and famine, which is the large section in the chapters there that we'll look at. He also let his wife Jezebel influence him. And we see this in chapter 21, verse 25, where it says that she urged him on with his evil, which is a pretty strong statement. He allowed his wife to threaten Elijah. And then she orchestrated the murder and theft of Nabal because he wanted the vineyard. And that's kind of spelled out in chapter 21 there. And then Ahab set Ben-Hadad free instead of God's will was to have him put to death as a foreign king that he was at war with. And then he surrounded himself with yes men. I thought this was interesting. He had all these prophets that just told him what he wanted to hear. And there was all this pressure, he had all these people around him just to tell him what he wanted. And of course, that leads to anyone's downfall. Gehazi, Elijah's servant, also we see his disobedience. He lied and received gifts against Elijah's will. And then he actually got Haman's leprosy as a consequence of his sin. There's more sin in there, but those are kind of the main ones. And there's a lot going on, as you'll see or have already seen. Then I also noticed something interesting, the leadership influence that we see with the kings and the ones that come after them, and father and son relationships a lot of times. So we see there was a good influence with David on Asa, and then there was also a good influence with Asa on Jehoshaphat. And those are the only two we see examples of. And then there's a whole bunch of bad influences. Jeroboam seems to be had a lot of bad influence. So we see Jeroboam's on Nadab, Rehoboam on Abijah, Jeroboam on Baasha, Jeroboam on Zimri, Jeroboam on Omri, Jeroboam on Ahab. And then we see Ahab's bad influence. And what's just interesting is Jezebel's also included here. First time a wife's included. So Ahab and Jezebel and Jeroboam's bad influence on Ahaziah. Jeroboam's bad influence on Joram, and then Ahab's on Jehoram. So a lot references there to the specific following in a leader before those footsteps, either good or bad. Then we see a lot about Elijah, a lot of miracles. We see God providing for him with the ravens and the widow, and that he confronts Ahab. We're going to look at that a little bit. I thought that was interesting. And then challenges the prophets of Baal. And we see fear and depression. I want to look at that a little bit too, that Elijah faced. And then transition to Elisha. Then we see hardships give opportunity for growth. The widow at Zarephath. And we see even Elijah crying out to God, like, why are you allowing this to happen to her? And we see them both grow in this. And the widow says, surely there's a God in Israel. And then the famine in Samaria allows a lot of growth too. Then we see Elisha, and we see the apprenticeship that he had with Elijah. And then he asked Elijah for success, and then a lot of miracles with Elisha as well. And then we see God's grace and patience. We see Elijah with this, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, so I'll skip that part in the notes here. And then we see Ahab. He actually humbles himself, and God actually notices that, which is pretty cool. God even says to Elijah, did you see that? Did you see what Ahab did? And this was the guy he was bad. And yet even a really, really bad person who humbles himself, God pays attention to that. Captain Ahab's army humbles himself when he sees the other two sets ahead of him of 10 soldiers. Fire comes down and consumes them. He comes and he humbles himself and asks Elisha, please have respect for my life. And so we see that God has grace because of that humility there. Then we see he provides for the Shunammite woman. And this is kind of interesting, chapter 8, 1 through 6 of 2 Kings. It's not very obvious, but you see God orchestrates things at just the right time so that she is provided for. And you can look at that. Judah, we see God's grace and patience with Judah. And so he didn't destroy Judah because of David's sake. And there's 2 references to that. What I thought was kind of neat too was the majority is not the basis for what's right or what's successful. We see that with Elijah and 450 prophets of Baal. So you got one prophet that's God's using and all these false prophets and of course Elijah's right and prevails against the 450 prophets. Micaiah and 400 prophets, he's the one that tells the truth. The rest of them are all telling Ahab what he wants to hear. And then Elijah and Ahab's army, we see him there against the whole army. And then Elisha and his servant against Aram's army. And then a lot of figures of speech. I didn't write them all down, just a few. Even if you were to give me half of your possessions, like a reed swaying in the water, uproot and scatter, in the eyes of the Lord, rested with his ancestors, arousing his anger, deal with me, be it ever so severely. We've seen this one used a lot. Enough dust that remains in Syria to give each of his men a handful. So they're going to really wipe it out. That was the threat there. Mark my words, the hand of the Lord. Don't ask for just a few. Lamp in Jerusalem, referring to David's inheritance, his continual reign. And what I thought was interesting is the use of sarcasm here. And we see this as Micaiah. He actually means the opposite of what he says because of Ahab's reaction. He says, sure, attack and be victorious, when Ahab knows he's just being sarcastic, which again, you mean the opposite of what you say when you're that way. So a couple of things I wanted to just highlight quick. And I really like when Elijah confronts Ahab in 1 Kings 18, 17 through 18. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, you troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. What I like about this is a lot of times evil people will blame God and his people for hardships they're facing. what I like about Elijah is he just puts it right back on Ahab and says, no, I'm not a troubler of Israel. You're the troubler of Israel because of you sin against God. 1 Kings 21:20-22, we see this again. Ahab said to Elijah, so you have found me, my enemy. Again, he sees Elijah as his enemy because he's disobeying God and going against God. I have found you, he answered, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. He says, I'm going to bring disaster on you because you have aroused my anger and caused Israel to sin. So again, Elijah is blamed by Ahab for what's going on when the reality is Elijah puts it right back on Ahab because it's his doing. But I thought this was interesting. We see Elijah's fear and depression, and he is threatened by Jezebel. And she basically says that may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Now, this is interesting because you would think Elijah would know better. There are no real gods other than the true God. But I think he's afraid and runs because I think he is assuming that Jezebel, Ahab, the whole nation is going to have this change of heart and everything's going to be wonderful. When the reality is on this earth, that never happens. You don't get 100% of the people that turn to God. That would be great, but that's what heaven's about. So I think he went into a depression and was afraid of her and ran because he had this high expectation that God didn't meet. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Boy, we can relate to that, can't we? Then I like God's grace and patience with Elijah when Elijah's facing this fear and depression. 1 Kings 19:5-9. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back to him a second time. Isn't that great? God's a God of second chances, second times, right? And touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights. So we see God's grace and patience with Elijah, providing for his physical needs while he is afraid and depressed. And so he reached the mountain of Horeb, the mountain of God, and then he went into a cave and spent the night. Then we see God's grace and patience. So not only does he provide for his needs, but he also lets Elijah talk, which is real important. Then the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, I think this is really great because I think a lot of times when we have failed our God and we failed ourselves and ran away and became afraid and depressed, I think we feel that God's going to come down on us like an earthquake or in a lot of power. And God doesn't do that. He takes care of Elijah's physical needs, and then he lets Elijah talk. He simply comes to him in a whisper, comes alongside of him because God knows what Elijah needs. And he basically says, what are you doing here? Like let's talk about this. He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. We also see this in, that was verse 14, in verse 10 too. So this is the second time he's been able to kind of talk about it and get it out. God's gracious, patient, and wants us to talk and process and get through things. And then once we have that ability to process and get past it, then God puts us back to work. And that's part of his grace and patience. Gives us another opportunity to serve him. 1 Kings 19:15-18. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So what is he doing? He's putting him back to work as a prophet of God, as a trusted servant of his. So what a gracious, patient God we have. And he's also reminding Elisha, you're not the only one, even if it feels that way. Sometimes we feel like we're the only ones doing what God wants, when the reality is there's a lot out there. Great to have this opportunity to share with you. Look forward to talking to you soon. God bless.